supplies weapons to terrorists on the African continent, from war-torn Libya to the forests of the Sahel, Mozambique and other parts of the African continent. Sophisticated weapons find their way into the hands of insurgents, destabilizing nations and casting innocent lives. But who is fueling this chaos rampant on the African continent is worth noting that this has been a cankerworm that has been eating up on the African continent for decades. But of course, we ask ourselves if those fueling this chaos on the African continent are corrupt officials, foreign profiteers, global aim or global arms networks, or above, all of the above. Amidst the said chaos, could youth empowerment be seen as an exit route to fighting terrorism on the African continent? It's time to follow the money, trace the bullets, and expose the silent hands beyond or behind this violence. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, do stay with us as we uncover the web of complicity feeding terror on the African continent in the face of terrorism. This is Talking Point. Stay with us. Beautiful televiewers and listeners, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Points over your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa, where we shall be talking this day about terrorism on the African continent, a plague that has been digging deep into Africa for decades. And of course, we shall be trying to provide solutions on how to go about, countering this terrorism issue that has been plaguing the continent of Africa. To discuss this topic of discussion this day, first of all, I've been joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist and the CEO of CROSTON FINTECH. It's a pleasure to have you on board, sir.
Thank you so much for having me, Sharon, and thank our viewers for tuning in as well. I hope that we will have a very fruitful conversation today.
It's equally a pleasure to have you on board. We're hoping that the rest will join us as we debut today's conversation. And now, since we're talking about a matter that's so much, pertinent in the continent of Africa, time without number, this issue of terrorism has been evoked. And of course, when we are having this conversation, in a bid to chart the way forward. So, in a bid to debut to this conversation, Dr. FONGOD, a month ago, that was in April, we saw the Prime Minister of Slovakia, who stated during an interview that most of the weapons that are destined for Ukraine always or more often a time find themselves or find itself on the African continent in the hands of terrorists or in the hands of insurgents. From your perspective as a Pan-Africanist, what are the main sources of weapons, being used by terrorists on the African continent?
I think that we need to carefully examine exactly most of the sources of the weapons. And the reason why I say that is because a lot is being masked in the name of the black market. The black market obviously has always been a source of weaponry, especially when it comes to terrorist groups. But the truth of the matter is that we need to look a little bit deeper and begin to hold countries accountable, for these serious issues and crimes against humanity that is being performed constantly, almost on a daily basis on the continent of Africa. I do believe that there is no reason why we should basically shy away from calling countries like the United States of America, calling countries like France, calling countries like Russia, everybody, including China, because their weapons of war has ended up on the African continent. I think that what is happening so far as the Ukraine war is concerned, most of those are US-made weapons that have ended up in the Sahel, that have ended up in other parts, in the Maghreb, in the greater Maghreb area in the Sahara, that has ended up on the African continent. So we need to be able to make sure that we call these folks out, especially when it comes to the life of our own people. And secondly, I think that we also must be able to start calling people who have done things, decisions that has been made that has created the mayhem that we are facing on the continent. There will be absolutely very little conflict, especially in terms of its scale still in places like the Sahel, had it been Libya was still standing and Gaddafi was still alive. And the reason for that is because most of the weapons we found in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, including northern Nigeria with Boko Haram that is operating in Nigeria and Cameroon, the weapons of war came directly, most of them from Libya, from the fall of Libya. And that you will credit a man like Barack Hussein Obama, or you will talk about someone like Hillary Clinton and her cronies, in Europe. We need to effectively begin to talk about these issues, without being scared, without being, thinking about what would be the consequences if we do. The reality is time has come for us to be able to fully not just understand the sources of these weapons that are roaming on the continent of Africa, but to call those who are directly involved and then begin to look for ways in which we can be able to scale this, into the international court, even if it's just symbolic. But I think that men like Barack Hussein Obama, I think that people like Hillary Clinton, I think that everyone who is responsible, based upon the recent revelation, which has been denied vehemently by the United States, by a U.S. congressman, that the United States was there sponsoring Boko Haram, to the tune of about 700 and something million US dollars. That in itself is something else through the USAID. That is something else that cannot just, go silently. We need to fully examine what the hell happened and what has been going on. I think that time has come for us to look at this, and secondly, also try as much as we can to examine who are these terrorist organizations, what is sponsoring this ideology, and if we can be able to fight this ideology maybe on the basis of dialogue, and try as much as we can to change culture and be able to present a better alternative rather than the trajectory to which it is that most of these terrorist organizations are operating on.
Exactly, Dr. FONGOD. But then you mentioned that we have all the sources, other routes through which we have these weapons coming into the African continent. Notably, you cited the black markets. Ladies and gentlemen, like we mentioned earlier on, we shall be unveiling our panel slowly but surely. And we just got indications that Chief MUSI was with us this day. His Grace is present. Your Majesty, you're welcome on board. I'll just debut with today's, or your question, so to say, just to pick up from where your co-panelist stopped. He cited that most of the weapons that end up on the African continent originate from international conflicts. Now, from your own perspective, how do these arms from international conflicts, out of the African continent end up in the hands of African insurgent groups? For instance, we're not looking at internet groups. We've seen the chaos that they're doing in Somalia. We've seen the impact in Mozambique. We've seen in Libya. And you can name it, not to talk of what's happening within the Sahel region. So from your perspective, what route does this follow to end up on the African continent? Your Majesty, you with us? Hopefully, we'll be able to get back to you. We're not too sure of what's happening, but Your Majesty, once we can get hold of you, it would be a pleasure to have you share your insight on today's edition of the program. So back to you, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. I was asking that, given you cited that notably armed conflicts or these weapons originate from international conflicts, what route does it take for these arms to leave from international conflicts from elsewhere and land in the hands of insurgents on the African continent?
Well, the reality is that we have to fully understand, the black market. I think that there are a lot of groups out there that are responsible for doing nothing else but, making money from selling weapons of war on the continent of Africa. I think that is quite historic. It's well documented. But then we also must be able to segment the entire conflict we have on the African continent, and then we look at what is going on in terms of ideology ideology. For some strange reason, there is these very complex issues we have on the continent, which is about how most Africans, and especially those who want to align themselves with what is politically expedient, and folks who basically do not want to call things for what they are, they basically just shy away from a whole lot of issues. And I think that time has come for us to basically understand this. And the reason why I say so is because if we do not fully understand what is going on, it will be extremely quite difficult for us to basically present a more robust front when it comes to us fighting terrorist organizations and terrorist groups on the continent of Africa. So imagine that you walk over into a hospital, or you were called up into a group and you were part of a think tank, maybe to address a particular issue. Imagine that this think tank or this group of doctors, you were part of a group of doctors looking at a patient chart, and that patient is suffering from cancer. And all they tell you is that the patient is suffering from cancer. That's not good enough. What we need to do is try to figure out what type of cancer is this patient suffering from. And the reason for that is because then the treatment that we're given will have to be different. So if we're going to have any kind of medication that has, high efficacy, then that simply means we must make sure that we're addressing the type of issues that this particular individual is having. On the continent of Africa and in most part of the world, especially in the Western Bloc, the moment you ask terrorist organizations, when you ask what particular terrorist groups is operating and what is the ideology behind the terrorism, everybody seems to shy away. Let me say this to you. On the continent of Africa, 90%, I'm talking about 90% of all terrorist activities on the continent of Africa is tied to Islam. All of them, 90%. So if you look at what is happening in the Greater Maghreb, the Greater Maghreb is northwestern part of the Sahara. All right. If you look at what is happening in the Greater Maghreb, all of the terrorist organizations in the Greater Maghreb are all Islamic terrorist groups. If you look at what's happening in the Sahel, exclusively are all Islamic terrorist group, from Boko Haram to ISIS to the Al-Qaeda in the Greater Maghreb, you name it. Everybody operating in Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, all of them are all tied to Islam. If you look at what is happening in the Eastern Bloc, you're looking at places like Kenya, or in the Eastern Bloc, from Al-Shabaab to everybody in between, almost all of those groups are connected to nothing else but Islamic terrorist groups. And the only time we have a mixture is when you come down a little bit towards the Congo, where you have Al-Qaeda and other groups operating in that part of the regions of the world, including portions of Mozambique. My idea is this: if we do not fully understand the bigger problem we have, which has to do with Islamic terrorist ideas and ideologies operating on the continent of Africa, it will be extremely quite difficult for us to come out with something that is quite robust as to help the issue. And the reason for that is because we are dealing with an ideology. We are dealing with the people who believe certain values, who believe in certain utopia, in the way certain things has to be done. And it is not about maybe an issue of land. It's not about territory. It's not about something that has to do with minerals. These are not people who are fighting, for independence. There's no independence. There's no country. They're fighting for nothing else but this French ideology about this utopia that is coming, where you have to align yourself, kowtow to a particular idea so far as religion is concerned. If not, you're considered to be an infidel and good for nothing else but death. These are men who believe that they're doing God's beating. They are doing God's work. These are evangelists of death. So it is extremely quite difficult for us to be talking about fighting terrorism on the continent of Africa if we do not fully understand what this terrorist organization looks like, what the ideology that is running this satanic machines look like, and then be able to come up with some kind of a conclusive idea, have maybe policies that basically address this issue, not just from a very superficial a template, but address it from its core, which means we need to be able to understand what Islamic terrorist organizations believe and the different versions, because Al-Qaeda has a different mindset, ISIS has a different mindset, what makes them different, and then from there be able to now begin to reach out to the very young people who are roaming the streets of Sahel, who are nothing else but prime target for this terrorist organization, to indoctrinate them into this French ideology, because obviously there's an expression that says an idle mind seems to be Satan's workshop or the devil's workshop. If that was going to be the case, because we have a lot of young people who are not employed, a lot of young people who basically are disenfranchised from society, a lot of young people who basically live below the poverty line, people who have absolutely nothing to lose, when they now hear this utopia about this, you know, this heaven, this place that is coming, if only they have to die to get there, we now have to be able to present a better option, that you don't have to die, you don't have to violently die and become so callous by killing people before you get to this location. We can create this location here. Anyone who is working and anyone who has a good job, anyone who is given a better life, will have absolutely no reason to believe in this utopia if we can create this beautiful utopia here for them.
Thank you immensely. But just following out your response, you stated that it's imperative for us to tackle this issue of terrorism right from its core, right from the root causes. And now, just to follow up, how can youth empowerment on the African continent alongside sensitization go a long way in ensuring that we overturn the impacts of terrorism, or gradually or slowly but surely, you know, uproot this cankerworm of terrorism on the African continent?
I think we can do that if you look at areas like the Sahel and you try to figure out what is absolutely going on in relationship to the recruitment of young people into ISIS or into Al-Qaeda. You will realize that conflict, all right, tribal conflict, is a major problem. And so once you have a terrorist group that comes in and align with a particular tribe and tell them that we're going to be able to help you overcome this particular tribe, if only you believe in what is it that we are talking to you about, we'll give you the weapons and we'll fight against you, and we have this holy war that we need to be able to push because these people will become infidels. That is where problems do start. And the reason why we have these tribal wars, obviously, is because if you look at places like the Sahel, you know, you have people who are indigenous of the Sahel, people like the Berbers. These are people who basically have been roaming the Sahel for thousands of years. It's home to them. These are nomads, people who graze, and so their constant motion, their constant habit of moving and looking for greener pastures begins to now fall in people who are basically now farming, and that is the basis of all of the conflicts that we have. Same in Nigeria. If you look at what is happening in Nigeria with the level of carnage that is taking place in Nigeria, it has to do nothing else with herdsmen, you know, basically colliding with people who are basically running their agricultural projects and bringing their cows into herds of cows into people's farms, and then, you know, there goes the carnage that we see, which is basically even outside of what Boko Haram is doing. So we need to be able to fully understand this, and if this was going to be the case, then we need to be able to have policies that addresses this issue. Then whatever it is that ISIS and Boko Haram will try to do will absolutely have no fuel to run on, reasons being everybody will be taken care of. We can be able to have a whole entire grazing areas for those for folks who are basically doing their cattle raiding. We can be able to have sections that is quite quarantine off for those who are basically farmers. There are ways in which we can be able to do this, incentivize these people and let them understand that they don't just have to roam the Sahara. We can actually mechanize farming like we do out here in the West in such a way that everybody is taken care of. Mechanized agriculture, especially agricultural farming, especially when it comes to cattle railing. We can be able to arrange that in such a way that they don't have to be roaming through the Sahel, you know, looking for greener pastures. We can bring greener pastures to them, and it can also be another opportunity for the people who are farming to farm hay, which is grass, that will be used to feed the cows, you know, in the areas where they are quarantined off also. In that way, you know, it's easy to fatten these cows up so that they don't lose a lot of calories, you know, in going up and down, and then more meat in the marketplace. So it's when we basically start talking about, you know, mechanized farming, especially in places like Sahel, this will absolutely, you know, be a better front in being able to curb this ideology. We still have to address the issues of ideology, but we need to be able to put an end to the foil that is giving this ideology the flame to which it is that is burning.
Thank you immensely. We just got indications that Chief MUSI is back with us on board. And now, Chief MUSI, hopefully, though we might have some delays in transmission, we're hoping that you can be able to, you know, share your insight. Now, picking up from where your co-panelists stopped of, you know, uprooting or targeting the root causes of what's fueling this tourism on the African continent. From your perspective, do you think that that there's some way through which we have key actors, be it at the level of the African continent or out of Africa, that may be playing a crucial role in ensuring that we have these illicit weapons, you know, entering the continent of Africa? Because we recall that in as much and up to date, we've still had the African Union's silencing the guns bill for 2030, which was earlier on shifted from 2020 to 2030. And up to now, we still have weapons on the African continent, as well as the heinous killings which we are seeing in diverse regions across Africa. So from your perspective, do you think there are key actors within and out of Africa that might be, you know, helping this process?
Well, first, thank you very much, Sharon, for having me on, and my regards to Dr. FONGOD. It's been a while, and glad to be on the show. I'm really not on seat. I'm a little bit out of the region, and I'm actually connecting with you people very far off, and the network is not quite good. But yeah, I think I've been following up the program. First, I want to appreciate the insight by Dr. FONGOD on the current situation. The analysis were quite good. And if I may add to what Dr. FONGOD already said, let's be rest assured that one of the reasons why we have most of this funding, because we cannot only look at it from the perspective of having weapons with terrorists. What actually causes these people to provide these weapons to these terrorists? Because if there is no need, if there is no demand, then there will definitely not be any reason for them to have weapons or to use weapons. And we are talking about weapons which are only used to kill human beings or to kill against humanity. So, I mean, it means we are destroying humanity. But my input on this, it's very much from the standpoint that most of these weapons come into Africa through illicit means, like he rightly said, but we should also bear in mind that in as much as it comes through some of this black market, as Dr. FONGOD said, we should know that there are some countries in Africa that have weak legal systems on arms dealing. And with these weak legal systems, most terrorist groups use these countries to easily penetrate or infiltrate their weapons through these countries. And I think that's one of the reasons. But also, I think it is important to highlight the fact that most governments also have been sponsors of some of these terrorist groups. And if I'm the government and I'm sponsoring a terrorist group, I definitely have the power of export and import. And it's but normal that these goods can also go and reach the terrorists based on our own internal arrangements. Exactly. Let's not also forget that some of the with these people we call people who give aid, some of these countries that give aid to countries in crisis situations, also some of these organizations also help to transport, or they also help to fund terrorist groups or provide them with weapons. Let me be very categorical here that the reason why would you want to sponsor a terrorist group? Because of the minerals in Africa. Mm-hmm. And most of this sponsorship is coming from out of the country, it's out of the continent, out of Africa, which means that we are only making reference to the fact that Africa remains a bedrock for humanity. Africans' raw material is a need for the Western world, and in as much as that need continues to exist, the Western world would always continue to support some of these terrorist groups. The ISIS, under the Islamic group, you know very well that a country like Iran has been noted internationally for providing weapons to most of the Islamic terrorist groups. And if Iran is party to a convention with other countries, it means that those other countries with whom they have a partnership could also be a means to facilitate through their own medium the transportation and providence of weapons to most of these terrorist groups. And some of these terrorist groups like the Hezbollah and all of this, they have brother or sister groups across Africa that they collaborate with. And like I said, if a country has a weak system, they will always have a weak transport system. They will always have a loophole how these weapons can always move to meet the terrorists. I think that's one of the easiest things that governments have been able to facilitate. But I think all of this goes back to the fact that they are yearning and looking forward to the raw material that's in Africa that they need in the Western world, and they'll always continue to sponsor these terrorist groups.
Exactly, and they always say a divided house cannot stand. Maybe they might be feeding on that. Just to stay with you, Chief MUSI, listening to what you just said so far, could you agree that the porous borders which you have on the African continent and weak custom control in one way facilitates the trafficking of weapons across Africa?
It definitely does, NJIX. It definitely eases the transportation of these weapons because, take for example, most of these weapons they are metallic. They are not as, because most of the terrorist group, they don't use very heavy duty equipment, mechanized duty equipment. Most of them are using the weapons like the AK-44. They are using IEDs, improvised explosive devices. They are using RPGs. They are using, I mean, these are some of the things that they use. And imagine they are using drones. These things are very portable. And I can assure you that with this portable stuff, they can easily transport them across governments. And some of these things also are being transported by the system in place. I'm talking about the military system in place of some of these governments, or where they harbor terrorists. For example, some will plan, attack, and then give weapons to the terrorists, and then they move. These are things that we have seen. These are things that we have referenced. These are things that they have researched upon. And yes, it is but normal that we take a simple example. You're talking about our custom systems. How would you explain that a country refuses to trade in fuel? In fuel, when the country is producing fuel, to trade in fuel from different countries, and the same country is still dealing in that same fuel, and it's being sold on the streets. The government officials are passing and seeing, the military is passing and seeing, the custom is passing and seeing, and the fuel is still being sold, which means that the system in place has been tailored in a way that they adapt and understand very well how these goods and services are easily assimilated into their countries. And I think that's the more reason why I say, with our porous borders, there is a laissez-faire attitude. There is a government policy that actually stipulates free movement of goods within countries, and at a certain point, the custom will use this law lapses to be able to allow some of these things infiltrate in their countries. But like I said, there is always the black market. There is always this illicit move. There is always this one that even the government and funding bodies help to transport these weapons to terrorists. Yes, I think we have very porous borders, and these weapons will always come into Africa.
Thank you, Mansley, Your Majesty. Now back to you, Dr. FONGOD. Have a listen to your co-panelist, Chief MUSI, and the point he cited. He said, you know, many times we have this system that favors the influx of these weapons on the African continent. Now, here is my question: are there documented cases of, say, government officials, military personnel, as cited by your co-panelists, diverting these arms to terrorists or militias within the context of the African continent?
if you looked at some of the documentations that came out of Nigeria, especially when they basically did a fact finding, trying to figure out what was going on. So far as Boko Haram was concerned, there were a lot of things that came out which pointed to the fact that there were absolutely corrupt officials in Nigeria that knew something about what was going on with Boko Haram, and the fact that there were a particular country that was obviously of a non-African origin, because these were Caucasians who came out with there were reports of villagers who spoke of the fact that there were helicopters landing in the night, in Boko Haram areas, where white men will come out unloading, boxes of equipment. Either these were black ops, or these were people who came in from who were basically affiliated with some black market. But what is quite interesting is the fact that there was a crash actually that had a whole lot of brand new dollar notes, $100 notes. I think it was, I can't remember what the division was, which is quite interesting. Dollar notes, in the plane, in the helicopter that crashed. And so the question that was being asked back then was if Boko Haram was now printing dollar notes. That was the telltale sign of some things to happen. So I think that there has been documented cases, especially when it comes to corrupt government officials having something to do with terrorist organizations. I think that there is no doubt about that. I also believe, in support of what Dr. Chief MUSI was saying, is that if you look at the customs system on the continent of Africa, I don't think that the customs system is lacking, especially when it comes to technology, to be able to dictate and know exactly what's going on. I think that we are also dealing with a lot of corruption. Because if you are anywhere on the continent of Africa, if you have the right amount of money with you, you can go through any custom post anywhere on the continent, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, uninterrupted. And that is a testament to the fact that we also have corrupt government officials who will do whatever it takes and allow this weapon support into their countries, just so that they can make a buck or two. That being said, one of the only things I think we need to be able to make sure that we start fighting is the fact that we need to begin to push Africans to be a little bit more Pan-Africans. So first of all, there's this thing about love for country. If you do not love your country, and honestly speaking, I have no idea, if you do not love your country, if that patriotic duty is not there for your own nation, then it is so sickening for me to sit over and watch an African fly an American flag, fly some Jewish flag, fly some some flag from some country, and flaunt the flag so beautifully, and speak of the fact that they're Americans now, and speak of the fact that they're God knows what now, and nobody is basically flaunting that same flag of their own nation. And it speaks of just how unpatriotic we are when it comes to where we come from, where we were born. And I think that except we begin to also push this Pan-African agenda, that we are Africans, and also push this love for nation and love for continent agenda, it will always be extremely quite difficult for us to have a foothold, especially when it comes to us fighting terrorism on the continent. But I think are there corrupt officials? Obviously there are tons of corrupt officials everywhere, especially if you've looked at some of the reports concerning Al-Shabaab operating in Somalia, Kenya, and God knows what else on the Eastern Bloc. There are tons of corrupt officials responsible for a whole lot of bad things, including security forces, people who ought to protect, people who ought to be there to serve the public, to protect the public. They become some of our worst nightmare.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chief MUSI. I would like to find out from you, now looking at the context of Africa and the recent attacks we've seen, we saw recently when the Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, he underlined that his priority was to erase the attacks like terrorism in his country and declared war on the insurgents that kept attacking Mogadishu. Now, looking at Africa, do you think that these recent attacks we have seen across Africa go a long way in, highlighting some of the loopholes of the agenda Silencing the Guns, or the program Silencing the Guns 2030 of the African Union? And how can we ensure that even though there are lapses, we can be able to, chart a perfect path that will go a long way in erasing this plague on the African continent?
I think, Sharon, we have talked about this several times on this program, and we have insisted on the issue of being Pan-Africanist and loving your own country, loving your continent. And Dr. Fonged is saying the same thing, that if we don't love our country, if we don't love who we are not building any legacy for Africa. Mm-hmm. So I think I still share the same notion with him, that we have to start loving Africa. Whatever regulations we put, Agenda 2030, whatever, stop arms and all of that, it's not going to work out. It was 2020, it's moved to 2030. It's not going to work out. Why is it not going to work out? Because we don't have that patriotic love for our country. We don't have that love for Africa. How would you explain that an African president or a leader in Africa is having a nationality in a different country and is ruling in Africa? How do you explain that? How do you explain that countries in Africa do not allow for dual nationality? How do you explain that I, as an African, I go to a foreign country, I naturalize there, I lose my Cameroonian citizenship? How do you explain all of this? This is where the problem is in Africa. This is where our problem, we need to first start having that love for country. And that love for country, it begins with citizenship. It begins with you knowing that you belong to this country and upholding to the norms, the ideologies, the principles, the colors of the flag, and of course, the anthem of that country, the motto of that country. So my concern here is whatever decisions are being taken by the African Union, whatever decisions are being taken by our leaders, there will always be an opposing faction that wants to share the ideologies of the colonizers. And when once that opposing factor keeps sharing the dream of the colonizers, they will keep promoting terrorism. That is why we are insisting as Pan-Africanists that we need to build a Pan-African dream, where everyone has love for country, everyone wants to be an African, everyone wants to be a Cameroonian, everyone wants to be a Nigerian, anyone wants to be anyone across Africa. So, to me, it starts from there. These terrorism groups, they exist. The government will say, we don't know where these terrorists are, but they still fund these terrorists. How would you expect that this will come to an end? There is the principle of divide and rule. There's a principle of setting in-house confusion, in-house fighting. And when once these ideologies are instilled in people, they keep relying on, like we said, selfish government officials, corrupt government officers. They keep pushing for this agenda to continue. And that's how Africa remains in the drain. So whatever situation, whatever agreement is being taken by the African Union, who even funds the African Union? Who runs the African Union? Is it being run by different states in Africa? Is it being run by the Western world? How would a Western country have a permanent seat in the African Union to sit there and monitor and hear what Africans are planning, hear what they are saying, and then go and send them guns? This topic is very sensitive because most of the crimes is up in Africa is being perpetrated by arms, is being perpetrated by the guns. So if we don't stop the fact that we create internal conflicts within Africa, if we don't look at how our government needs to have a unified Africa, have a Pan-African mentality, and believe in Africa, have our own currency, have our own ideologies and principles, and impose them on the West, we are definitely going to remain under the colonization the colonized principles, and once we remain under these principles, they keep enforcing in us their plans. And most of the problems in Africa and across Africa has remained the illicit acquisition of firearms to use against our own citizens, thereby creating tension, creating division, killing our own brothers and sisters, and at the end of the day, we remain puppets to the West, and they keep reaping from our rich natural resources in exchange of weaponry that they provide for us to use and kill our brothers and sisters. Yes, let's stop this. Let's be Pan-Africanists. There are countries in the world, Switzerland. There are countries that live without an army. There are countries that live without, they don't fight wars. Why can't Africa be like that? We have all the raw materials to even produce our own weapons. So at the end of the day, let's produce these weapons. Let's allow for Africans to have dual nationality and be able, I should be able to be in America and be an American citizen and still maintain my Cameroonian nationality. So much so that I can come back to my country and still feel African. With the knowledge acquired, I should be able to come back and develop my own economy. That is what Traore has been pushing. If you listen to him a few days ago in Russia, that is what he said when he met with the students of the one university in Russia. He was telling the African students, the Alliance, the AES students, that they should come back from Russia with the knowledge and improve the Sahel region. So these are some of the things we need to start propagating. All the knowledge acquired, all the Africans that are out of the country who go and surrender their African nationality should be given back their African nationality so that they could come back to Africa and still speak as Africans and develop Africa, not remain like the Barack.
Unfortunately, we lost you, Chief MUSI. Thank you so much for, please can you proceed? Unfortunately, the network have started messing up again, but then thank you so much, Your Majesty, for that response, and that will be leading me to the next question, which I'll be, giving to you next, or your co-panelist. Dr. FONGOD, having listened to Chief MUSI on that, as far as, the limitations of the silencing the guns of the agenda for 2030 is concerned, on your part, on numerous occasions, remember you have cited that the collapse of Liberia in 2011 resulted into these attacks which we are seeing on the African continent. So I would like to find out once again, it might just be you reiterating, what impact the collapse of Libya in 2011 had as far as the proliferation of these weapons across Africa, and how can we go a long way in resolving this problem?
If you look at what happened in Libya in 2011 and subsequently the emergence of these weapons of war that were absolutely under the control of Mohammed Gaddafi, which basically flew south through the Sahara into Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. If you look at the intensity of the fighting that ensued thereafter, it is nothing else but a clear-cut indication that there was possible idea by Barack Hussein Obama, Hillary Clinton, and those boys in Europe was to topple Gaddafi. Gaddafi had concessions. Gaddafi did every single thing else that he had to do. There were reports about Gaddafi basically sending informations, to the White House as to his surrender. But the reality was that Barack Hussein Obama had no other interest in anything, including Hillary Clinton, but to assassinate, Mohammed Gaddafi. And as a result of that, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Cameroon, including, as a result of Boko Haram, paid the ultimate price also. I think that the greatest atrocity on the continent of Africa, will not come just from the hands of the slavers. It will have to come from the hands also, of a fake son of the continent in the name of Barack Hussein Obama. I don't think that there are too many kind words for me I can offer to a traitor, someone like him. There are not too many kind kind words to come out of my mouth to somebody who obviously, if I was ever going to run the African Union in its new version, because frankly speaking, whatever it is right now needs to be dissolved, and then a new version needs to be created. We basically created the AU from the OAU. We can as well come up with something else that is quite meaningful, quite militant in nature. If I was ever going to do anything like that, the very first thing I would do is to pass a resolution that states clearly that men like Barack Hussein Obama, forever and ever will never step foot again on the continent of Africa. And the reason for that is because of how shameful and how disgraceful his presidency was so far as the continent was concerned. You would think that having a half black man who basically was supposed to mixed race show up and have a little bit more sympathy and be a little bit more aligned with the culture and the destiny of the African, he became our greatest nightmare. That being said, I think that we need to be able to address, whatever is happening in the northern regions of the continent. The problem we have in addressing Libya is that countries that surround Libya are countries that do not really consider themselves to have anything to do so far as Black Africa is concerned. We are talking about countries like Morocco, countries like Tunisia. Those countries, they tend to align themselves more with Europe than they do with sub-Saharan Africa. And so it is extremely quite difficult to propose an idea on how we basically put an end or help Libya heal and help Libya get out of this crisis, that have ensued for a decade now. The only way I think we should be able to do is to build up a robust force, a robust front, within the Sahel region that will basically create a buffer from that madness pushing itself south into sub-Saharan Africa. And so that's why I'm a big fan of the alliance of the Saharan state, because then they are doing whatever it takes to be able to not just defeat this madness, of these weapons coming south, of terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda moving south into sub-Saharan Africa, but also making sure that the whole entire region basically has nothing at all resembling terrorist organizations. The whole region is sanitized from these terrorist activities, and then we can begin the healing process in places like the Sahel. I don't know how we address Libya if not that there has to be concerted efforts among her neighbors, Tunisia, places like Morocco. These are countries that has to do whatever it takes to be able to make sure that they bring some form of order into Libya, and they have the military might, they have the military capability to do so. And I think that there have to be some real intervention in Libya. Otherwise, it will continue to be a safe haven for terrorist groups and also a safe haven for trafficking of arms into sub-Saharan Africa, and that is something else that cannot be allowed.
Okay, Dr. FONGOD, I do agree with you, but I'll just shoot my question straight forward. I'd like to stay with you. If we have to lay this side by side, the manufacture of weapons and the spread of these weapons across Africa, to what extent would you say arm manufacturing countries are responsible for tracking where their weapons end up where their weapons finally end up, be it in Africa or elsewhere?
Well, the problem is there's nothing you can do with the manufacturer. So the countries that are manufacturing these weapons are countries that you can only talk, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Okay.
There's nothing we can do so far as China is concerned. There's nothing we can do so far as America is concerned. There's absolutely nothing we can do so far as any other country in Europe is concerned. We can hardly even do anything on the continent of Africa so far as other countries on the continents are concerned. So if you're talking about manufacturing and manufacturers and what they do with, their weapons of war that ends up on the continent of Africa, there is really nothing we can do about it. The only way we can be able to solve this particular issue is on trade. I think that that if we do whatever it takes to be able to affect the market, and which will be in most part quite small but extremely quite significant, if we can do so, which means, you see what Trump is doing with tariffs? We basically need to be able to make sure that we call out countries whose weapons of war have ended up on the continent of Africa, and basically tariffs the living daylight out of them. But for that to happen, that also means we must be willing to go through a period of pain and then build up our own local industries so that we can be able to effectively ignite these tariffs and put an end to whatever is coming in from those countries into our own economy. The only way to do that is that we must be willing to sacrifice, number one, build up new trading partners that we can be able to substitute whatever we are not getting from countries like the United States and those boys in Europe, and including China, because China is also has to be part of the mix. Reasons being, weapons made in China are also on the continent of Africa. Weapons made in Russia are also on the continent of Africa. AK-47s of Russian origin, RPGs of Russian origin are on the continent of Africa, and has been for many decades now. So we need to be able to, categorically state that weapons, people who manufacture weapons of war cannot send us guns and food at the same time. All right, you cannot be sponsoring, talking about building coalitions on the continent of Africa to be able to help us emerge and grow and have a prosperous, continent, and at the same time, you are the source of our own greatest nightmare, which is the civil wars, the terrorist activities that we have on the continent of Africa. There has to be a divorce between goodwill and this mindset on arming terrorist groups and different factions on the continent. And when we talk about the pain we face, it's not just about terrorism, it's about civil war also. If you look at the sheer volume of civil wars that we have on the continent of Africa, especially in one particular country, which is basically the DRC, if you look at what is happening within the DRC, you have to be able to say to yourself, there has to be a whole lot more done, something else that is outside of the preview of the United Nations, something that is outside of the preview of the EU, because these two groups are absolutely as useless as their names. They mean nothing, absolutely nothing. Whenever I think about the United Nations, I don't think about any other thing else. The only thing that comes to my mind is Rwanda. When I think about the AU, all right, the only thing that comes to my mind is the DRC. And so the question becomes, what are the uses on the continent of Africa? Absolutely nothing. Useless. So if we are able to go country by country and then begins to create new trading partners on the continent and also with different countries, that will eventually help us curve, the way and give us a little bit more voice, especially when it comes to us talking about trade in relationship to these different countries. Frankly speaking, maybe most Africans will not understand this. The West and the East, that means Europe and America, and the East, Russia, China, they need Africa. Africa does not need them. The only reason why we have this useless idea that Africa basically needs the West or needs the East is because we have very corrupt people who are running most of our governments, and who has given us this, who have lied to us for so many years, that if we do not do certain things, and then the quota, all that free money that is coming in from the West and, in some part from the East will not come. But the problem is that if you look at every single money that's been donated, including the USAID money that used to come from the United States of America, I think the number is even staggering. I was telling somebody that if you think about corruption, so far as the world is concerned, the corruption that is taking place on the continent of Africa is uneducated corruption. They are committed by men who are uneducated, people who didn't go to school. So the corruption in Africa is like a primary school corruption. In America, it's Harvard level corruption, all right, like Harvard level. Because how do you explain the fact that for example, USDI, which basically American Foreign Aid, sent out $1 million to an organization in Africa. The organization in Africa, which is obviously going to be connected to some corrupt politician, who receives 300,000, because 700,000 is administrative cost. Do you understand that? It's administrative cost. This is insane. Administrative cost. And then on the 300,000, imagine that you're funding a hospital and a check for $1 million is cut to that particular hospital, and $700,000 out of that 1 million is administrative costs, paper, you know, bosses, people moving around, driving in Porsche cars, and then talking about the fact that they're taking care of the continent of Africa. And then when the 300,000 out of the 1 million eventually gets to Africa, because the person on the African continent is actually signing for 1 million, even though they are receiving 300,000, then whoever received the 300,000 eventually takes maybe another 70% of the money, and only 30% of that 300,000 basically ends up to where it's actually going. So by the time the corruption basically spill, $1 million will not be equivalent to even $50,000, will not have done the job that it was intended to do on the continent of Africa. So in other words, we don't need it. So whatever we call foreign aid, that amount of money you hear is not the amount we get. So we have been doing very well with that foreign aid, and there's no reason why we should continue to be talking about foreign aid. Foreign aid is a money laundering scheme for those in the West. It has no benefit at all on the continent of Africa. Frankly speaking, we need to begin to do things ourselves and pull our own self by our own bootstraps. I think time has come for us to become independent, not just in terms of trade, not just in terms of agriculture, not just in terms of foreign aid, but also in terms of the liberation of our minds. We need independence in the mind. If we cannot be able to liberate ourselves in our own consciousness and divine thinking, I tell you the honest truth, this cycle will not end.
And the cycle would not end indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point of our Pan-African channel, For You Media Africa. You're watching us on For You Television and listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3. And today on the menu, we're talking about terrorism on the African continent, asking the question, who supplies weapons to terrorists in Africa? Meanwhile, we are having guests on today's conversation, and I'll continue with you, Chief MUSI. You heard your co-panelists, and of course we highlighted that the numerous ways through which we can revert or avert the consequences or curb the spread of these weapons leading to the hands of terrorists on the African continent. But here is the question: what can international laws, treaties that exist already on the African continent, like we mentioned earlier, youth empowerment, sensitization, go a long way in preventing arms trafficking and thereof effectively reducing the arms that get into the hands of terrorists on the African continent?
Most of these treaties, they have never been long-lasting. They have never been very practical. They have never yielded their expected benefit. And because of this, I think it is time for us to change the way we Africans actually trade with the West. Because if these were internal African treaties, it would have been different. So the faster we can create the United States of Africa or United Africa, the better for us. Because when we are signing a treaty and we know that our problems are collective, we do it and bear in mind that it is our thing. It is ours. Okay, look at the example Dr. FONGOD was given. He's talking about $1 million. What if we're talking about $1 million rand or $1 million, some African currency? If we're talking about $1 million naira, $1 million this, it makes some difference, because our currency will reflect what we have. It will reflect our raw material. It will reflect our system of living. It will reflect our economy. It will reflect our raw materials and all of this. How do you explain that for how many years we are still under colonization with a certain kind of currency? So these treaties we are talking about, that if we have to look at these treaties, how they can curb the illicit supply of weapons or movement of weapons across Africa, I will tell you it's not ending anytime soon. We need to build a new Africa. We need to build an Africa with concerted mind. Like Dr. FONGOD said, we need to have liberation up in our brains. It's very important to highlight this, because in as much as we do all of this and put them on papers, they never ever serve the purpose for which they were intended. And our corrupt politicians, our corrupt leaders, they keep collaborating with the West. They keep implementing the regulations of the West. Like he said, you cannot come and give us aid of 1 million naira, and at the same time it reaches us less than 50,000, and at the same time again you turn behind us and we take loans from you, and the loans that our governments take from you, you still provide us with these loans, and in exchange of our raw material that is 1:200, the loan is 1:1. So we need to build a concerted Africa where we start. He said, yeah, we don't need the West. We don't need the West to develop Africa. The West needs us because they need our raw material to be able to do what they are doing, to be able to develop their industries, to be able to develop their saturated economies where they take this raw material. Look at Africa. Most of the raw material that comes out of Africa is being used by the West to provide, to produce arms. I insist, most of the raw material that comes from Africa is used by the West to produce arms. If it's food, if it's agricultural inputs or produce, they take it and they go and process it, and then they sell it back to us at an expensive rate. Meanwhile, they buy it from us at 1:100, and then they come and sell it to us at 1:1,000. So what I'm inversely saying is that if they are not taking our raw material to produce arms and sell it to us at a higher cost, or use it to fight, to kill humanity or destroy humanity, they are taking our food and our food produce to process them and send them back and sell them to us by still granting us loans to continue to reap our raw material. So let us Africans start looking at, what do I have in Cameroon that can benefit someone in Chad? What do I have in Burkina Faso that can benefit someone in Nigeria?
Exactly.
What do I have in Ghana that can benefit someone in Togo? If Cameroon has a lot of fuel and Ghana does not have fuel, and Ghana has minerals, they should be able to trade with Cameroon, fuel mineral exchange. If Burkina Faso has minerals, golds, and all of this, they should be able to trade with Nigeria in exchange for their oil, to be able to use this gold and minerals to produce firearms in Nigeria. These firearms is to equip Africans to be able to fight when the time comes for them to show their might and their strength. Because whatever equipment that are produced by the West, they are taking raw materials still from us. So at the end of the day, even in some of their factories and industries, some of the most intelligent engineers that work there are still blacks. They are still Africans. And so we need to start moving out of this mental slavery to see how we can develop, we can build Africa to a continent where we produce our own. We loan money amongst ourselves in Africa. We use our different raw materials to produce what we want to use, what we want in Africa. And if we are trading with the West for the things that we want to buy from the West, I'm not saying we should stop trading with the West. And we have to do that. It should be the kind of a thing that the Sahel are doing now with Russia. You see, Russia is coming into the Sahel. They come on the table. They sit on the table. They do agree, and they buy and they purchase and they go. You know, another country comes and takes the dregs from the gold mines and reprocess it and comes out with gold. So let us, as Africans, we will keep saying this as Pan-Africanists. We'll keep saying this and keep insisting until the day Africa will wake up. We need to do the things in Africa that benefit us Africans and be able to intertrade between us as Africans. I don't need to go pay for a visa to go to a country in Europe where the visa conditions are so alarming just because it's like I'm begging to go stay there. Look at what the president of Namibia did. The president of Namibia said, if you have to come into a country, go get the visas, get residence permit and all of that, and come stay in a country. No more visa-free options. So, in effect, what I'm trying to say here is that it is important we start learning from the development that is taking place in the Sahel. Because I was going to ask you, Sharon, that you can organize another show for us to talk about what are the mistakes that someone like Ibrahim Traore is making. You will be shocked that our program will not run for up to 30 minutes. communist, because we'll not have anything to say about his mistakes. We'll instead be looking at mistakes of his compatriots and analyzing them to fit our context. So yes, let's start building an Africa that is a concerted Africa, and together we work this dream out. That's the only way we can come out of this. As to stopping these firearms deals, our governments are still too corrupt to an extent that they will never stop it, and they will keep doing it. If the government is being serene, the opposition will come in and do. Look at what happened in Tanzania. We had a conversation here. So these are things that will happen. If the government is not doing it, the opposition is doing it in favor of the West. So let's build a concerted African dream. Thank you.
Thank you so much, but I'd like to stay with you, Your Majesty. We've got barely 5 minutes before we wrap up today's edition of the program. But then your co-panelist, Dr. FONGOD, earlier on highlighted that there is some sort of link between resource exploitation on the African continent, that is the minerals that exist on the African continent, and the financing of weapons being purchased by terrorist groups. Now, you mentioned equally that it's important for us to have a united Africa. In just some 1 minute 30 seconds, how soon do you see this happening?
I think while they are thinking of stopping firearms in 2030, we are thinking of emerging as Africa by 2030. That's the most I can say, because I see that most countries in Africa have a functional system of about 7 years of governance maximum, and leadership changes hands. And from at the rate at which there is this change and there is this coup, there is this revolutionary thing happening across Africa, I'm sure that by the time they are looking at stopping the guns by 2030, we'll be looking at a united Africa by 2030, 2035. Yeah, because the kind of mindset that we, the younger people are having, it's drifting away from the mindset of the politicians and their quest and their united front with the West. And I'm sure that with the kind of leadership that we are having, the kind of young people that are coming into politics, and the kind of development that has taken place, technological advancement, Africa would soon emerge. And of course, we will have all of the Africans that are out there in the West come back and invest in Africa, and we'll build a united Africa by 2035.
Indeed, that is the goal for the African continent. I'll be coming back to you just to wrap up, but I'll take Dr. FONGOD first. Dr. FONGOD, you've listened to your co-panelist, His Majesty Chief MUSI. What practical steps, because I want to believe you equally share some sort of political view, what practical steps can African governments and civil society groups, take to cut off the weapons supply chain on the African continent in some 1 minute 30 seconds before we can conclude?
I think that we need to be able to fight this issue by making sure that corrupt government officials are basically handled severely. We also need to be able to make sure that the ideology that is falling terrorist groups on the continent of Africa, we basically fight that ideology with knowledge, with wisdom, with understanding. We also need to be able to make sure that young police officers, young military people who basically, or even old, no matter how old they are, who are part of the force are paid, well, so that they don't have those incentives to be able to sell their weapons or government-issued weapons, to terrorists and claim that they have been stolen or some misharm has happened to them. I think that we need to be able to do that. If we are able to just have these little things done and be able to push into the consciousness of most Africans, especially those who are responsible for our own safety and security, that this continent is home to each and every one of us, that the country to which they were not just born because it was a freak of nature that they came into that particular nation, but it was like a God-given mandate for them to be born in that nation, that we can be able to build this beautiful country or this beautiful continent we call home. I'm also a big-time believer that the idea for 2035 as an emerging Africa, that 2035 is going to be a wonderful and a beautiful year. I have to say this to you, that if 2025 is going to be great, then the 2035, 2030 will only be great as what we do today. So whatever we do now, it's basically tomorrow. And I think that whatever happens tomorrow will be the steps we take today. And so the first step for an emerging Africa, the first step for a beautiful Africa will be that every single African has to fall in love with the continent, fall in love with your country, be one with your country, be pro-African, be Pan-African, be Africa's first, be Cameroon Cameroon, first be Nigeria, first be everything first so far as Africa is concerned. In your attire, in the music you listen to, in the consumptions of food, in pleasure, whatever, be Africa. And if that was going to be the case, then maybe 2025, 2035, 2030 will happen. If not, I guarantee you, you cannot do the same thing over and over again, and then suddenly you expect that things will change. Things will always be what they are. If the outcome is undesirable, check the input. The reason is because nothing changes if we do not change. I think that for the change we're expecting to see, we have to change. And I call on Africans, for each and every one of us, to change.
Indeed, like you said, the time for change is now, and it's left for every African, to contribute to this great change. And now, to wrap up today's edition of the program, I will now give the floor to His Majesty Chief MUSI. You listen to your co-panelists, having outlined all the different points which constitute how towards the supply of weapons on the African continent, in leading to a better continent, more prosperous continent, more, a free continent where every African can live peacefully. Chief MUSI, what should be the way forward for the African continent? Just a few words before we draw down our curtains.
I would say here that Africa remains Africa. Our land boundaries, the people, our infrastructures will remain Africans. The legislations might change, government might change, people might come and go, but there is always a revised edition of every book. There is always a new beginning, and if Africa has to emerge, they should start learning from the changes that are taking place in the Sahel. They should go and read the new notes called the Notes of Traoré. They should read those notes, go and see what that young man is doing in the Sahel, and look at what is happening in Senegal, look at what is happening in other African countries, and learn from it. And if they take those examples and build Africa, Africa will become a wonderful place to be. And let those old leaders move away and give room for the younger people to be able to sit on the table with new energy and boost Africa. They can pretend. They can even pretend some of the coups and say, I was assassinated, but I don't think the people, the younger generation will kill them. They can put them aside, push them away, and then develop Africa. Let's work from there and read from the Notes of Traoré.
Exactly, and of course, together we can make this continent a great. That was Chief MUSI, Pan-Africanist, will join us in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist and doubles as a traditional leader. We should equally acknowledge the participation of Dr. Stanley FONGOD, who joined us today in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist and the CEO of CROSTON FINTECH. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, that is our out, and we have come to the end of today's edition of Talking Point of our Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. It was a pleasure to be in your company. If you watched or you listened, we'll say thank you. And of course, do stay tuned to more programs on For You Media Africa. Bye-bye.